The black SUV slammed into my sedan, metal screaming, glass exploding. My father's attorney, the man who taught me to drive, was behind the wheel, his face twisted with something worse than hate. I had 30 seconds before he crushed me against the stone pillar, and the only way out was a drainage ditch I'd helped design years ago. My hands shook on the wheel, but I knew the estate's weak points. One wrong move, and I'd be buried in my father's driveway. The engine roared again. Closer. I jerked the wheel hard left, feeling the tires skid on wet gravel. The ditch was coming fast, and so was the SUV. If I failed, I wouldn't just die. I'd never know why. The iron gates of the Sterling estate loomed ahead, twin skeletons guarding a kingdom of manicured lawns and buried secrets. David Sterling gripped the steering wheel, the stitched leather damp beneath his palms. High-beam headlights cut through the evening mist, reflecting off the polished hood of his sedan. He reached for the dashboard console, his fingers hovering over the record button of the hidden dash cam. He needed this record. He needed a blueprint of this night, because, in the Sterling household, the truth was often a load-bearing wall that his father liked to move without warning. A roar shattered the silence. From the deep shadows of the oak-lined driveway, a black SUV lurched forward. It didn't merge. It hunted. The engine's growl vibrated through David's chest cavity, a low-frequency hum that signaled a structural failure in his plans. Metal shrieked as the massive vehicle swerved, its chrome grille expanding in his rearview mirror like the teeth of a predator. David's eyes darted to the dashboard. 40 miles per hour and climbing. The SUV wasn't trying to pass. It was angling for a T-bone collision, aiming for the softest part of his sedan's frame. David slammed his foot onto the brake. The tires screamed against the gravel, kicking up a cloud of gray dust that tasted of sulfur and burnt rubber. To his right, the ancient stone pillar, a jagged monolith of granite, rushed toward his passenger door. He yanked the wheel, muscles locking in his forearms as he fought the steering rack. The SUV's bumper clipped his fender with a bone-jarring crunch. Glass exploded. Shards showered the interior, sparkling like diamonds in the strobe light flicker of the hazard signals. He exhaled a ragged breath, the scent of ozone and hot coolant filling his lungs. Through the spiderweb cracks in his windshield, the tinted window of the SUV began to slide down. David didn't wait to see the face inside. He shifted into reverse, the gearbox wailing in protest, and tore his way back toward the secondary garden paths he remembered from his childhood. He knew these grounds better than any surveyor. As a boy, he had measured the distance between the oaks to build a fort his father later burned, and that spatial memory now became his only map. The SUV roared behind him, its headlights bouncing wildly as it navigated the uneven turf. David steered his sedan onto a narrow walking path, the side view mirrors clipping overgrown hedges with a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. He could feel the tension in the air, a physical weight pressing down on the car's roof. Ahead lay the decorative drainage ditch, a concrete scar hidden by high reeds and rotting lilies. To a stranger, it looked like a flat patch of tall grass. David knew the drop was exactly 4 feet, reinforced with jagged limestone. He floored the gas, feinting toward the open lawn, then yanked the handbrake. His sedan spun in a tight, controlled arc, tires biting into the mulch. The SUV driver, blinded by the dust and fueled by aggression, didn't see the trap. The heavy vehicle surged forward, its tires leaving the ground for a fraction of a second before it slammed into the ditch. The sound was spectacular. A sickening crunch of a snapped axle, followed by the hiss of a ruptured radiator. The monster was high-centered, its wheels spinning uselessly in the mud like a flipped beetle. David didn't linger. He abandoned his car, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he sprinted toward the side service entrance. The air was thick with the cloying scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. He reached the heavy oak door, his breath coming in jagged stabs. A shadow moved in the doorway. "Master David," a voice whispered, heavy with a shuddering sigh. It was Miller, the groundskeeper. The man looked smaller than David remembered, his skin etched with lines that looked like dried riverbeds. Miller's hands were trembling so violently that the small plastic object he held clattered against the doorframe. "You shouldn't have come," Miller muttered, his eyes darting toward the security cameras that blinked like red eyes in the dark. He shoved a small, cheap burner phone into David's palm. "The perimeter is compromised. He's not alone, David. He's never alone anymore." "Who was in the SUV, Miller?" David asked, his voice tight. Miller didn't answer. He let out another long, mourning sigh and retreated into the darkness of the potting shed, leaving David alone with the cold metal of the burner phone biting into his skin. David flipped the phone open. A single GPS coordinate pulsed on the screen, a digital heartbeat in the palm of his hand. It pointed toward the local impound lot on the edge of town. Curiosity, or perhaps a lingering sense of architectural duty to see a job through, led David back toward the wrecked SUV. He approached the ditch cautiously. The smell of scorched dust and gasoline was overwhelming here. The driver's side door hung open, swinging on a broken hinge with a mournful creak. David leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man slumped over the steering wheel wasn't a hired thug. It was Michael Davis. David's breath hitched. Michael had been his mentor, the man who taught him how to read a contract and how to spot a lie in a deposition. Seeing him here, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, was like watching a foundation crumble in real time. On the passenger seat lay a folder with David's name on it. He realized with a jolt of ice-cold clarity that the dinner invitation hadn't been an olive branch. It was a cage. Michael had been sent to ensure David never reached the manor house, to isolate him on the outskirts of the property where a tragic accident could be easily explained away. David backed away from the wreck, the burner phone heavy in his pocket. He turned toward the main manor, the massive stone structure looming over the trees like a tomb. He had to face the architect of this nightmare. The manor house was a labyrinth of sight lines. As David stepped through the front entrance, he felt the familiar prickle of being watched. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors lined the hallway, forcing him to confront a dozen versions of his own disheveled reflection, mud-stained, wide-eyed, and trembling. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It felt like a countdown. He followed the sound of clinking silverware to the dining room. The space was a sterile white theater, the air holding an unnatural chill that made his breath mist. At the head of a table set for 12 sat Arthur Sterling. He was perfectly composed, his silver hair catching the light as he cut into a rare steak. The scent of seared meat and expensive scotch filled the room. "You're late, David," Arthur said, his voice like gravel over velvet. He didn't look up. "And you've made a mess of the driveway." On the wall behind Arthur, a large flat-screen television was muted, but the images were loud. A grainy overhead shot of a silver sedan, David's car, fleeing a dark intersection. The headline scrolled across the bottom. "Greenwich hit and run, mother of 2 killed. Police seek silver sedan." David felt the floor tilt. "What is this, Father?" "It's the end of your vanity project," Arthur said, finally looking up. His eyes were unblinking, cold as marbles. "The world thinks you're a killer, David. And who am I to argue with the news? Arthur reached into his pocket and pressed a button on a small remote. A sharp, mechanical click echoed through the room. Suddenly, a high-pitched hiss erupted from the crown molding. A cloud of fine, stinging mist began to spray from the ventilation ducts. David coughed, his throat seizing. It smelled like industrial bleach and pepper. The chemical burned his eyes, turning the white room into a blurred, agonizing smear. He tried to move toward the door, but his legs felt like lead. He collapsed to one knee, the polished marble floor cold against his palm. Through the haze, he saw Arthur calmly sipping his scotch, measuring the liquid with a laboratory beaker before pouring it into his glass. "The security system is quite efficient," Arthur remarked, his voice muffled by the ringing in David's ears. "It's designed to neutralize intruders, or in this case, to ensure a guest doesn't leave before the authorities arrive." Subverted beat 2.3. David's hand went to his pocket, his fingers brushing the burner phone Miller had given him. He felt a surge of hope, a spark of tactical brilliance. Miller was the only one who had shown him an ounce of kindness. The groundskeeper had risked everything to hand him this lifeline. David knew how these things worked. The GPS coordinates on the screen likely led to a safe house or a cache of evidence Miller had hidden over the years. If he could just get a message out, if he could call the local precinct or even a private investigator, he could blow this entire frame job wide open. He fumbled with the device, his vision swimming as the stinging chemicals continued to pour from the ceiling. His thumb found the call button. He would call Robert Thompson, the police officer he'd met at the firm's charity gala. Thompson was rigid, but he was fair. He would listen. David's thumb pressed the screen. For a second, the phone stayed bright. A green bar appeared at the top. Connecting. David let out a ragged sob of relief. He could almost hear the dial tone, the sound of salvation. He just needed 10 seconds of clear air. Then the screen flickered. A jagged line of static tore through the digital interface. The green bar turned a violent, bleeding red. David stared in horror as a single word appeared in the center of the display. Wiping. The phone began to vibrate in his hand, a frantic, death-rattle pulse. The GPS coordinates, the only lead he had to the truth, dissolved into a jumble of nonsense characters before vanishing entirely. The contact list emptied. The call log turned to zeros. The device grew hot, the smell of scorched plastic rising from the casing. David frantically pressed the buttons, his heart plummeting into his stomach. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice cracking. He tried to restart the device, but the screen went black, a dead slab of glass. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The phone hadn't been a lifeline, it was a tether. By turning it on, he had triggered a remote kill switch. Arthur hadn't just anticipated David getting help. He had provided the very tool that would ensure David felt the sting of hope before it was ripped away. He was now truly isolated, his only potential evidence erased by his own hand. He had walked right into the architectural trap, thinking he was finding a secret exit when he was actually sealing the vault from the inside. The silence that followed the phone's death was heavier than the chemical mist. "Looking for a signal, David?" Arthur asked, the clink of his glass against the beaker sounding like a judge's gavel. "In this house, I am the only signal that matters." David's lungs burned, but the adrenaline began to override the sting of the gas. He looked up to see a shadow detached itself from the heavy velvet curtains near the sideboard. A security guard, a man with a neck thicker than David's thigh, stepped forward. He held a taser, the twin electrodes sparking with a terrifying blue light. The guard lunged. David, fueled by a sudden feral instinct for survival, grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the table. As the guard swung the taser, David parried the strike. The glass shattered against the guard's forearm, showering the floor in bourbon and shards. The guard roared, but David didn't stop. He used the momentum to shove the man toward the open closet in the hallway, a space originally designed for guests' minks and overcoats. With a desperate heave, he slammed the heavy oak door and jammed a decorative mahogany chair under the handle. The guard's fists began to pound against the wood, 1,000 fists on a door. But the structural integrity of the chair held. David leaned against the wall, gasping for air. His eyes fell on a manila envelope resting on the sideboard, right where the guard had been standing. He snatched it up, his fingers trembling. Inside were documents that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just a confession for the hit and run. There were bank ledgers forged with his signature, showing a systematic drainage of the firm's pension fund. Millions of dollars diverted to offshore accounts in David's name. "The firm is broke, David," Arthur said, standing up and smoothing his tie. He adjusted it exactly 3 times. "I needed a way to settle the accounts. A dead or imprisoned son is a very tragic, very distracting headline. It buys me the time I need to exit." Arthur checked his watch. "The police will be here in exactly 1 hour. I've told them you're armed and unstable. I've told them you confessed to the woman's death in a fit of remorse. By the time they sift through these papers, you'll be behind bars, and I'll be on a plane to a country that doesn't care about Greenwich socialites." Arthur turned and walked toward the back of the house, disappearing into the shadows of his private study. A heavy steel door slid shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. David was alone in the dining room, the ticking clock now a deafening roar. He had 60 minutes to find a way out of a blueprint designed by a master of deception. He ran toward the study, his mind racing through the floor plan. The windows were reinforced, the doors were locked from the outside. He was a prisoner in his own legacy. He began to tear the room apart, his hands moving with a restless, architectural precision. He measured the distance between the bookshelves, looking for the hollow sound of a hidden compartment. Behind a row of leather-bound law books, his fingers brushed something cold and metallic. He pulled it out, a small digital recorder. His heart leapt. Arthur was a man of habit. He recorded everything, every deal, every threat. If there was a recording of Arthur discussing the frame job with Michael Davis, David might have a chance. He pressed the play button, holding his breath as the device whirred to life. But before he could hear a word, the intercom system crackled. Arthur's voice filled the room, amplified and distorted. "Attention, Greenwich PD," Arthur's voice said, though he was clearly speaking into a phone. "My son is in the study. He's lost his mind. He's talking about ending it all. He says he can't live with what he did to that poor woman. Please, hurry, he has a weapon." The lie was so perfect, so structurally sound, that David felt the air leave his lungs. He was being painted as a suicidal killer before he could even utter a word of defense. In the distance, the first faint wail of a siren cut through the night air. The sound of the sirens acted like a physical weight, pressing against the walls of the study. David knew the Greenwich PD. They were efficient, well-funded, and tonight, they were being led by Robert Thompson, a man who believed in the letter of the law with a religious fervor. To Thompson, Arthur Sterling was a pillar of the community. To Thompson, David was the spoiled heir who had finally snapped. David looked at the recorder in his hand. This was it. The foundation of his counterattack. He just needed to find the right file. He began to scroll through the digital interface, his eyes darting to the heavy steel door. He could hear footsteps in the hallway. The second guard, the one Arthur had kept in reserve. The door handle rattled. Then, a heavy blow struck the wood. David scrambled backward, his heels catching on the edge of a Persian rug. The guard burst through the door, a burly man with a military gait. He didn't hesitate. He tackled David, sending both of them crashing into a glass trophy case. The sound was like a bomb going off. Crystal awards, silver cups, and glass shelves shattered into a million jagged diamonds. David felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as a piece of glass bit into his skin. He groaned, the scent of old parchment and cigar smoke in the room being replaced by the metallic tang of blood. He kicked out, his boot connecting with the guard's shin. The man grunted, but didn't let go. They rolled across the floor, over the shards of David's childhood achievements. David reached out, his hand closing around a heavy marble bookend. He swung it with every ounce of desperation he had left. The guard went limp, sliding off him and onto the floor. David lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, the rhythmic ticking of the clock now joined by the frantic thumping of his own heart. He looked at the recorder. It was still in his hand, miraculously unbroken. Subverted beat. 3.5. David pulled himself into a sitting position, leaning his back against the mahogany desk. This was the moment. He had the recorder. He had the black box of the Sterling Empire. He imagined the recording he was about to find. Arthur's voice, cold and clinical, detailing the embezzlement. Michael Davis's nervous agreement to the hit-and-run plot. It would be the structural failure that brought the whole house down. He could already see the look on Officer Thompson's face when he played the truth. He felt a rare, fleeting sense of victory. He was the architect now. He had found the flaw in his father's design. He pressed the play button on the most recent file. The speaker crackled with white noise for a heartbeat, then a voice filled the room. But it wasn't Arthur's. "I did it," the voice whispered. It was shaky, thick with a sob. "I didn't see her. The rain, the car just... I couldn't stop. Father, you have to help me. I killed her. I killed that woman." David froze. The blood in his veins turned to slush. He knew that voice. It was his own. He played the next file. "The money from the pension fund. I needed it. The firm was failing, and I couldn't let them see me fail. I moved the millions. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." David's head spun. He hadn't said those things. He had never spoken those words in that order. He listened closer, his architectural ear picking up the microscopic seams. A slight shift in the background hum between words. A mechanical cadence to the vowels. It was a masterpiece of audio engineering. Arthur had taken years of David's voicemails, birthdays, check-ins, business updates, and sliced them into a digital confession. He had used David's own voice to build his own gallows. The evidence he had fought so hard to find wasn't his salvation. It was the final nail. If the police found him with this recorder, it wouldn't matter what he said. The physical proof was his own voice admitting to the crime. Arthur hadn't just framed him with documents. He had stolen his very identity to seal the trap. David stared at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. He had spent his life measuring the world to make it safe, and his father had used those very measurements to calculate the exact dimensions of his ruin. The sirens were louder now, the blue and red lights beginning to strobe against the study's heavy curtains. He was trapped in a room with a confession he didn't write, a crime he didn't commit, and a father who was currently playing the role of the grieving parent for the police at the gate. He felt a wave of total crushing despair. Every move he made was anticipated. Every smart play was a pre-built lane leading him deeper into the maze. He looked at the shattered glass around him, the remnants of a life he thought he had built on solid ground. It was all sand. But then, his eyes caught a glimmer of something beneath the study's wet bar. In the Sterling house, everything was designed for show. But as an architect, David knew that even the most beautiful facades had to account for the plumbing. The wet bar in the study was an afterthought, added in the 90s during a renovation David had studied as a student. To save on costs, the contractors hadn't moved the main line. They had built a service hatch into the floor to access the pipes. It was a structural flaw, a hole in the plan. David lunged for the bar. He tore away the decorative brass kickplate, his fingernails bleeding as he clawed at the wood. Beneath it lay a simple, unpainted plywood hatch. He kicked it with all his might. The wood splintered, a satisfying, raw sound of destruction. He dropped into the darkness of the cellar. The air here was damp and heavy, holding a humidity that made his shirt stick to his back like a second skin. He could hear the police breaching the front door upstairs, the heavy thud of boots on marble, the shouted commands. "Clear the foyer. Move to the study." David moved through the cellar, his hands tracing the cold stone of the foundation. He wasn't looking for an exit. He was looking for the truth. He remembered the GPS coordinates from the burner phone before it wiped. They hadn't been a trap for the phone. They were a location. And David knew exactly where that location was on this property. The garage. The one place Arthur never let the staff clean. He emerged from a coal chute into the sterile, white-painted garage. The smell of gasoline fumes was sharp, making his eyes water. He ran to the back wall, where a series of built-in tool cabinets stood. He measured the distance from the corner, exactly 12 feet. He pushed against the plywood backing of the third cabinet. It didn't budge. He shoved harder, using his shoulder as a ram. With a groan of protesting hinges, the wall swung inward. There it was, a black SUV, its front grille crushed, the chrome teeth twisted into a permanent snarl. Dark, dried blood stained the hood, looking like rust in the dim light. David pulled out his smartwatch. It was a simple device, one his father had mocked as a toy for children. But it had a voice memo feature. He tapped the icon. Recording. "David?" He turned. Arthur was standing in the doorway of the garage, his tuxedo pristine, his face a mask of disappointment. Behind him, the shadows of police officers moved toward the light. "It's over, David," Arthur said, his voice loud enough for the officers to hear. "Just put the recorder down. We can get you help." David didn't look at the police. He looked at his father. "The woman you killed, Father. Sarah Johnson. She wasn't a random pedestrian, was she?" Arthur's eyes flickered. For the first time, the unblinking stare wavered. "She was the investigator you hired to hide the bankruptcy?" David said, his voice steady, projecting into the watch on his wrist. "But she found out the firm wasn't just failing. It was a shell. You hit her because she was going to the DA. You didn't just want to frame me for a crime. You wanted to bury the only person who knew you were broke." Arthur stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, predatory hiss. "It doesn't matter what you think you know. I've built a world where your voice says whatever I want it to say. Look at them, David. They don't see a victim. They see a killer." "I'm not using my voice, Arthur," David whispered. He pointed to the blood-stained SUV. "I'm using the architecture." Officer Thompson stepped into the light, his hand on his holster. He looked at David, then at the hidden car, then at the small, glowing screen of the smartwatch on David's wrist. "Mr. Sterling," Thompson said, his voice tight. He wasn't looking at David. He was looking at Arthur. "We found the audio equipment in the study, and we just found the car. Arthur's face didn't crumble. He didn't scream. He simply adjusted his tie 1, 2, 3 times and looked at the car as if it were a bad investment he was ready to write off. A structural failure, Arthur muttered, more to himself than anyone else. As the police moved in to handcuff his father, David walked out of the garage. The night air was cool, smelling of rain and the distant, clean scent of pine. The flashing blue lights of the police cars illuminated the stone face of the manor, making the grand estate look like a cheap stage set. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his retractable steel measuring tape. Zip click. He didn't need to measure the distance to the gate. He knew exactly how far he had to go. He left the tape on the gravel driveway, a small piece of yellow metal glinting in the dark. He walked past the iron gates, past the twin skeletons of his past, and into the silence of a life he would finally design for himself. The foundation was gone. But for the first time, David Sterling felt perfectly level.